Hosting our guest is Dr. James J. Carafano. Dr. Carafano is Vice President for our Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy Studies. He also serves as the E.W. Richardson Fellow. He serves as a Senior Fellow at George Washington University's Homeland Security Policy Institute. He is on the Board of Trustees at the Marine Corps University Foundation, serves on advisory boards for the West Point Center of Oral History, the Hamilton Society, and Operation Renewed Hope Foundation. He also serves as president of the nonprofit organization Esprit de Corps, which educates the public on veterans affairs. Please join me in welcoming Jim Carafano. Jim?
Okay, so let me just really quickly kind of run through the rules of the road here. I'm going to introduce Gene, and then he's going to talk about his book, and then we're going to were you okay with question and answer, right?
Yes, of course.
So I think it'd be great to really kind of get into a dialogue. So Gene's done, and then what I'll do is I'll kind of come back up, and then hopefully we'll have somebody with a microphone, and we'll do Q&A. And then if you have a question, if you just raise your hand, I'll recognize you, or Gene will recognize you, doesn't matter. And if you just wait for the microphone so people can hear the question online and in the archive edition. And if you would just kind of state your name and affiliation when you ask your question. And then we have a great saying here. Sometimes we start late, but we always end on time. So we will get you out of here promptly at 1 o'clock. And then we're going to say just maybe a minute at the end because I have to come up and do some more administrative things real quick. So this sounds a little strange, but I would like to introduce this book by talking just very briefly about another book that I really hate. No, I really like this is a very good book. No, some of you may remember Tom Barnett's book, which was kind of flashing, got a lot of attention a couple of years ago, called The Pentagon's New Map, and it's very interesting. Like all books that that you must read books. It was very interesting, very provocative, and very wrong. And he basically said, there's this arc of instability kind of running through the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. And what we need to do is reorganize all the instruments of national power to really focus on that. And a lot of I thought a lot of the critics weren't so much about arguing about this arc of instability, but it was this notion that somehow you didn't have to worry about anything else. So the parts of the world that were peaceful apparently were always going to stay peaceful. You didn't have to worry about alliance maintenance. You didn't have to worry about the future of other geostrategic regions. And a lot of people said, well, that just really doesn't make any sense. And actually, I can't think of a better example of that than the situation we have here. And the reason I'm very excited about this book, I think there are a few things that we could spend a profitable afternoon talking about different views and concerns about what's happening in the Ukraine and the future of the relationship between Russia and the West. So this is an enormous opportunity. I'm so excited. I mean, these days, in the heat of the moment, all you can do is read a blog post, right, or Twitter. But I mean, here we have an entire book, right? So we're just actually. So I think it's just very excited to have that as a basis of a kind of really thoughtful, good conversation. Gene Rimmer's basically a heck of a guy. But I'm going to do a little more than that. He is the Senior Associate and Director of the Carnegie Russia and Eurasia Program. His research focuses on political, economic, and security trends in Russia and the former Soviet states, as well as Russian foreign policy, especially its relations with the United States, China, and the Middle East. Prior to joining Carnegie, Gene was the National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council from 2010 to 2014. In this role, he led the intelligence community's analytic effort and served as a senior intelligence advisor to the policy community. From 2000 to 2010, he was a senior fellow and research director and a bunch of other stuff at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. He also served on the National Security Council staff in the State Department. He also served at RAND. Oh, wait, no, this is... I got this. I didn't actually know some of this stuff. The International Institute for Strategic Studies, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy Studies, and he once played baseball for the New York Yankees. No, I just made that up. But he did teach at Georgetown, GW, and to say he's widely published is very modest. He is undoubtedly one of the most important scholars thinking on this part of the world today. So it's very exciting to have him come and talk about his new book, Conflict in Ukraine. So, sir, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim, for this introduction. Thank you to the Heritage Foundation for hosting me here. It's it's really not a good time to think about Europe, think about European security, but you know, we tend to ignore some of these long-standing issues when times are good, and maybe it's a bit late, but better late than never. Let me just say a few words about how this book came about and what this book really is about and what it is not. My co-author, Rajan Menon, a professor and a long-time observer of the Soviet and post-Soviet scene, and I really thought that this would be a crazy undertaking to write a book on Ukraine in the middle of a crisis. But then somehow I thought, well, why not? And put together this book very quickly. It's about a 50-50 split between him and me. And the purpose really was here not to provide a blow-by-blow, step-by-step account of what was still happening in Ukraine, and it's still happening now, but we wrote the book last summer. That would have been an impossible task, let's be honest, because the fighting was still going on, and the Maidan was, to some extent, was still in place. But what we wanted to do in this book is take a look at some of the structural as well as temporal factors that got us to the situation that we're in, and also, you know, talk about some of the consequences of the crisis in Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine. We stopped the narrative in September of 2014, which, to be honest, was both a function of the production schedule of our publisher, but also it was a sort of logical place to stop because the conflict at that point reached a certain plateau with the first Minsk agreement signed in September 2014. And I would say the crisis has not progressed much beyond that point. It's still at that plateau, even now with the second Minsk agreement behind us. So there are a number of issues that sort of came to the fore at that point that have not been resolved. They're still with us. So in that sense, even 6 months later, so the book is not yet obsolete, which is gratifying to the authors and to the publisher as well. So let me very briefly go over some of the factors that I would describe as structural factors that led to this crisis. And in retrospect, there were plenty of reasons to think that this crisis was inevitable, but you know what they say about analysts and about the intelligence community where I served for a period of time is that we can never predict a crisis, but we can always explain why the crisis was inevitable. So let me tell you why this crisis was inevitable, although perhaps the timing was not easy to pinpoint. So if you look at the history of Ukraine, it is a history of really a place, a country, however you want to describe it, that lacks a clear tradition of statehood, and there is no living memory of Ukraine being an independent and sovereign state with all the essential institutions that we think of as being essential to the functioning of a modern state. In that regard, Ukraine, despite the fact that it is in the center of Europe, geographical center of Europe, and so close to Hungary, to Poland, countries that have been able to make a successful transition after the end of the Soviet occupation, Ukraine really, you know, unlike those countries, does not have a living memory. All those countries that were occupied by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II still had that living memory 40 years later, and that played a very important role in their ability to bounce back. Now, geography. If you look at the map of Ukraine, if you picture a map of Ukraine, you will see that actually it is a Soviet construct in its current form, and there's not a single neighbor of Ukraine that does not have a potential territorial claim against its territory. If you sort of go around, you know, Russia, of course, has spoken on this issue, not just spoken, but acted. But then you also have Belarus potentially could have some claims. Poland potentially could have some claims. Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and even though Ukraine does not have a land border with Turkey, but Turkey could possibly claim ownership of Crimea now that it was taken over by Russia. So again, it's a country with a very uncertain sort of geographical legacy, which is not to say that it doesn't deserve to be in its post-Soviet borders, but it's, again, one of these tenuous arrangements that politicians and politicians oftentimes exploit to their advantage. And then if you look at sort of the fusion of politics and economics in Ukraine, especially in the past 24 years, we're in 2015, since independence, and Ukraine emerged as a really this oligarchic state with the political scene and the commanding heights of the economy dominated by a rapacious class of post-Soviet oligarchs who fixed the political system in a way that benefited their commercial interest. And Ukraine, since the 1990s, really, since the earliest day, was not able to proceed with the reforms that other neighbors to the west especially were able to implement. So there were these historical, geographic, and domestic political and economic factors that produced a rather unstable environment in Ukraine, which in 2013 amounted to a crisis. And then there are several circumstantial factors that, despite their circumstantial nature, played a very important role in shaping developments on the ground. I had a chance to visit Kyiv in September of 2013, and there was no indication whatsoever when you talk to Ukrainian politicians, when you talk to Ukrainian political analysts, when you talk to businessmen, government officials, and U.S. embassy officials as well. There was absolutely no indication that this country would erupt in a mass uprising. Certainly that city, Kyiv, would erupt in a mass uprising with the intensity and the commitment that we saw just 2 months later. And now it's something that we cite in the book. If you look with the benefit of hindsight at some of the polling data conducted by independent pollsters in Ukraine, again, you come away with the conclusion that basically the people of Ukraine were absolutely fed up with all politicians, reformers, retrogrades, of every political stripe. And the only issue that seemingly could have possibly triggered a grassroots political movement was a rapid decline in economic conditions and the quality of life. But the notion that really something called DCFTA, Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement, basically a trade deal with Europe, that deal would lead to a mass uprising was something that nobody had predicted. And I should say that it wasn't only I personally or we here in Washington were not able to see what was coming, but there were other parties to this drama that were not able to and did not see what would happen just a few weeks later. I'm convinced that it was not visible in Moscow, it was not visible in the EU, and it was not visible in the Kremlin either, in Russia. And I like to use the comparison here to 4 ships sailing to a collision point, but the collision point is somewhere over the horizon, and they don't see it. They don't realize that their trajectories will collide, yet they did collide. And very briefly, I'll describe just these trajectories that the 4 ships were on. Ukraine, Yanukovych, was busy maneuvering, as he had done for some time prior to that, between Moscow and Brussels, seeking to gain the maximum financial advantage out of both, while keeping using Brussels to keep Moscow at bay and using Moscow to keep Brussels at bay in order not to get too close and to continue extracting the maximum amount of assistance and political support for his, at that point, still rather secure position, but with trouble on the political horizon because of the economic conditions in the country. The EU was pursuing what the EU always describes as a values-driven policy from Brussels. And that values-driven policy took the form of the association agreement and the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU, and it was all being pursued under the rubric of the Eastern Partnership, an initiative that the EU came out with after the war with Georgia in 2008, the Russian-Georgian war, as a new way to try to bring Eastern Europe, what we now call Eastern Europe, because now Eastern Europe is called Central Europe, but to bring it closer to the European Union. And although it was being pursued as an effort to expand EU norms and practices and values, and thus transform Eastern Europe into more, modern, properly functioning 21st century states, that initiative had, as it was being implemented, a clear geopolitical agenda as well. The two most active proponents of that policy were the then foreign ministers of Poland and Sweden, both countries that have a long and complicated history of, not always happy history of dealing with Russia. And both the Polish foreign minister at the time, Radek Sikorski, and Carl Bildt, the Swedish foreign minister, were well-known critics of the Putin government. So their leadership of that initiative was viewed in Moscow as suspect, shall we say. Russia, Putin, was pursuing a policy of Eurasian integration and trying to bring Ukraine closer to the orbit that it wanted to keep Ukraine in, that is, as a political and economic satellite of Russia through the policy of customs union and then Eurasian integration. And then you might ask, where was the United States? And my answer, and the book's answer, more importantly, is that the United States really was nowhere to be seen. Because the United States at the time really did not have a lot of attention to devote to Ukraine because we were, frankly, preoccupied with a variety of other crises. Jim, you already referred to us, in effect, being done with the European project and pursuing opportunities or dealing with challenges in the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf, in Afghanistan, and so on, dealing with resurgent China, pivoting to Asia Pacific. But Russia and Ukraine really were not top priority issues, and very few people were paying attention to it here in Washington. So when suddenly Yanukovych walked away from the signing, postponed the association agreement, now we know with the benefit of hindsight, because Putin had promised them a substantial bribe, in effect, it came as a shock to all of us. And what came as a shock to all of us even more was that hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian citizens in Kiev went out into the streets and demanded that Yanukovych reverse course and pursue the association agreement with the EU. And at that point, everybody, sort of all four ships or all four parties to this drama, fall on their, call it knee-jerk reactions. We, the United States, embrace freedom and democracy. The EU insists that any compromise between the association agreement and the free trade agreement on the one hand and the customs union that the Russians were demanding on the other hand is absolutely out of the question, and there cannot even be a conversation about that. Yanukovych continues to maneuver, and the people of Ukraine continue to protest. And from that point on, I would argue that what has developed in the months that followed these uprisings or these protests in Kiev is that really a parade of improvisations. And it really reveals that nobody who is a party to this drama really has a well thought out long-term strategy, and nobody clearly knows what they more or less want to achieve. That's what's realistically possible. Despite what Mr. Putin apparently has been saying lately about the takeover of Crimea being planned in advance, and I'm sure that the Russian military had planned, as all militaries do, prepare for contingencies for a variety of scenarios. But I'm convinced that Mr. Putin basically panicked in February, on February 22nd, when Yanukovych suddenly fled, and the seizure of Crimea and then the annexation of Crimea were not well thought out long-term moves by Mr. Putin, because ultimately he doesn't need just Crimea, he doesn't need just Donbass, as he's been fighting in eastern Ukraine for the past several months, for almost a year. What he needs is all of Ukraine. And the challenge for him really is that the deeper he pushes into Ukraine militarily, the more difficult it's going to be for him to reach a political deal with Kiev, unless he wants to occupy Kiev and install his government there, because the so-called party of war in Ukraine will not allow any government in Kiev to sign a deal that compromises Ukrainian sovereignty and independence. So you've had a succession of panicky or not well thought out moves by Mr. Putin that have not really produced the desired results, and in a sense backfired. You have the capture of Crimea and the annexation. I would argue it backfired. You have this idea of reconstituting this fictional state, Novorossiya, in eastern Ukraine, and some would argue it could spread all the way from the Russian border to the border with Moldova, Transnistria. Again, didn't happen because, frankly, it didn't get a lot of support in eastern and southern Ukraine, where a union with Russia, especially if it is pursued at the tip of the bayonets, and with the kind of shelling that that has taken place in eastern Ukraine, where people just don't want it. So it's clear that on the one hand, Mr. Putin is not prepared to see eastern Ukrainian separatists lose, but at the same time, it's not clear that he's prepared to push so far into Ukraine as to engage in a massive effort of military occupation of the country, because really, even for a newly refurbished, reconstituted Russian military, it is most likely a bridge too far and spells very different political and military campaign that he's been on so far. So where are we now, and where is this all going? I would argue, and I think the situation really has not changed since September, that we're in a stalemate. The political goals for the Russians, for Mr. Putin, are proving to be elusive. The cost that everybody's paying for this are nothing short of terrible. Ukraine is a broken country. I don't know what is the most accurate and the most recent estimate of what by how much the Ukrainian economy will decline this year. I've seen numbers in double digits, but clearly, if we're talking about the cost of reconstruction or any kind of normalization in eastern Ukraine, we're looking at tens of billions of dollars in years and years that, frankly, nobody either has or is prepared to commit at this point, which is a tragedy in its own right. The government in Kiev, by some estimates, will need upward of 20, maybe more, billions of dollars in additional financial assistance beyond what it has. Reportedly, it has something like $5 billion in currency reserves at this point, which it can blow through in a matter of days. And Ukraine is still a country that has not taken on the challenge of domestic political and economic reform and reconstruction. In many ways, it is still a country where the political system is dominated by the old interests. Maybe not the same old interests, because Donbass clearly is not as dominant in Ukrainian domestic politics these days. But we read stories about Ukrainian oligarchs now, some of them acquiring their own small armies, well-equipped, well-trained, and capable of fighting not just the Russians, but also to flex their military muscle against the government in Kiev. I will go not necessarily in the right sequence here, but for Europe, it's a crisis that nobody needs or wants. On top of the long-term crisis in the EU that has to do with the underperforming economies, there is the question of the long-term cohesion and the nature of the European Union. The term Grexit is on everybody's mind all the time, given the situation in Greece. But also, later this year, we'll have an election in the UK that could eventually lead to a very different arrangement, at the very least, between Great Britain and the EU, if not an outright departure. For Russia, and this is really subject for almost a separate conversation, but it's a shift in a direction that none of us, frankly, had perceived, even though there were signs of it building up, had been building up for some time. But especially in the past several days, the murder of Boris Nemtsov, the prominent opposition politician, and the way it's been portrayed and explained in the Russian media raises questions about Russian domestic stability, political stability, raises questions about what the Kremlin is up to and how far it is prepared to go. I don't know how many of you have seen just in the last couple of days statements from the Chechen warlord Ramzan Kadyrov, who basically justifies the murder, and not in quite so many words, but rationalizes the murder of Nemtsov. And just a short while later, he's awarded the Medal of Honor by the Kremlin as an upstanding citizen. So this whole relationship is both troubling and puzzling, and Russia basically has thrown out the last 25 years of its integration in the West, with the West, and its future at this point is very uncertain. And we can talk about this more. But last and certainly not least, where does it leave the United States? For 25 years, we have pursued the vision of Europe whole, free, and indivisible, at peace with itself and its neighbors, and that vision has been upended. We thought by the end of the 1990s, early 2000s, that we were done with the European project, and Europe would take care of its own challenges. In fact, we came to think for a while about European security as Europe projecting its security and stability outward. We talked about global NATO. Well, we find out nowadays that NATO's job in area is still not quite done, and that poses a huge challenge to us and to the European allies. So on this not very cheerful note, I'll stop, and we can deal with questions. So.
Thank you, Mr. Happy. So at least your talk matches the weather, which I think means something. So we have a question down here. So just wait for the microphone, please. Great.
Thank you. I'm a retired attorney in Washington. You mentioned in passing Russia needs Ukraine. Squib from your earlier presentation. Could you explain a little bit more what that means?
Right. I apologize for the shorthand, but in Mr. Putin's vision of this new construct, the Eurasian Union, Russia would act presumably as the center of gravity. You know, there's a saying, well, I don't know if it's a saying, but a friend of mine, a Russian friend of mine, has said, you know, no great power walks alone. So it's a constellation of smaller states that are important to Russia because of their geography, because of economic ties, because of other ties to Russia, that Russia exercises droit de regard over, pardon my, as a lawyer you probably know the term, oversight, has the right of oversight with respect to their foreign policy, their domestic arrangements. It's basically a protective belt in this very hard geopolitical vision of the world. So if you look at the map, Putin has been successful in promoting his vision with respect to Armenia and Belarus to some extent. But without Ukraine, that vision of a Eurasian Union is not quite the same as it is with Ukraine. It's a big gaping hole. Also in sort of this hard geopolitical kind of worldview that the Russians have embraced, Ukraine is the link to Europe. So for, I think, the Russian national security establishment, the idea of the EU, Brussels, having oversight over the pipelines that carry from Russia 30% or so of Europe's gas, that's not just an economic issue, that's not a commercial transit issue, it's a national security challenge. That's in the most sort of direct. There are also defense enterprises that Russia depends on. We've published some things on that on our website at Carnegie. So, yeah.
Building on your question there, Jennifer Amos and bureaucrat. Building on your statement earlier, you've talked about what this means for Europe. What does this mean for the former Soviet Union? When you were giving your history of Ukraine and how it's different than Bulgaria and Poland, I was sort of getting your history as more like a Kazakhstan. So, yeah, how do you think this plays out with the former Soviets?
Not very well. It's you know, it's not that they needed a wake-up call, because they've all been pursuing their very delicate relationships with Russia. And to give them credit, a country like Kazakhstan, the leadership in Kazakhstan, has succeeded in managing the relationship with Russia and with China, I should say, very skillfully. But it presents them with the challenge of a newly assertive, newly neuralgic, so to speak, perhaps, Russia that is even more prone than before to look not very kindly on their engagement with the West. So on the one hand, it limits their space. They don't like to be squeezed having to choose between Russia and the United States, because they'd like to, for the sake of balance, maintain relationships, multi-vector diplomacies, as they call it. But it also, I should say, does not endear Russia to anybody there. So, again, possibly a gain for Russia in terms of hard power, but I would say clearly a loss in terms of soft power, to the extent that the Russians really care about soft power.
Thank you. Boris Rifkin, attorney/policy analyst. A question about Putin and his motivations specifically. Prior to his assassination, Boris Nemtsov talked a lot about how this was really much more about Putin's personal need to preserve his domestic political position and to aggrandize power and to hold on to power. This really wasn't a strategic gambit. And like you said, that he might have panicked more than anything else. Do you think that what is happening at this point and how he's sort of continued to commit to this policy, and with Crimean sending billions of dollars in subsidies there to try to stabilize the situation, do you think that really it's a combination of geopolitics and personal kind of domestic power politics, or more one or the other?
Yes, I think it's a combination of the two, because he very clearly has staked his presidency on this, what do we call it, campaign, new policy, new course. If the Russian economy tanks, I mean, I don't think it's fair to say the Russian economy is in shambles, as the president said during the State of the Union address. But don't forget that one of Putin's major claims, one of his legitimizing themes throughout his presidency has been that he restored Russia to economic prosperity and political stability. So if the Russian economy continues to stumble and if the domestic political arrangement begins to fray, and the Russians are like us asking questions, you know, what does it mean when an opposition politician is gunned down not half a mile, not quarter of a mile away from the Kremlin walls, one of the most heavily patrolled places. And this was not just a marginal opposition politician, but someone who had served in a senior government position, so presumably people like him were not untouchable, but somewhat protected. And when Kadyrov, who is not particularly very popular in Russia, comes out and basically doesn't quite take responsibility for it, but says it was justified, you know, that raises questions in the minds of many Russians, I'm sure, about the course. Now, do we see this manifest itself in large-scale protests? I don't think it's likely. But again, I should say, predicting large-scale protests anywhere is a difficult undertaking. I wouldn't go there. But yes, I think this is a course that he is not going to turn away from for a long time. For the remainder of his presidency, this could be a long time. You know, his term runs to 2018, and then he's eligible to run again and be in office until 2024, and who knows beyond that. So,
can I just follow on that question and ask, is this had any ripple effect in other parts of Russia, or do you see any emergent issues in other parts like Chechnya or any other areas?
it will undoubtedly have effects throughout Russia, and there's some very good Russian analysts writing about this already. Again, we don't see this translate into political instability, and I'm not predicting that it necessarily will, because I should say something I haven't said, is that Putin, to the present day, has absolute mastery of the media space. The propaganda machine is fully under government's control. But you know, it could be a problem in Chechnya, could be a problem in the North Caucasus, or continuing problem, I should say, because the North Caucasus has been a region where Russia has had many problems for years and years. In part, if the resources to keep, as some Russian nationalists have said, if the resources to keep feeding the Caucasus are not there, then you will see greater pressures on the Kremlin to deliver, or there's going to be some friction there. It's likely to be a problem elsewhere, because the government in its current fairly limited economic circumstances is trying to shift responsibility for a number of spending programs onto regional governments. So that creates additional areas for friction between the center and the periphery, as we used to call it in the Soviet days. Again, this is not something that's going to manifest itself overnight, but give it time, and it will emerge as an important issue. So, just one, two gentlemen here.
My name is Hermes Levy. I'm from WS. My question is about how likely is to survive the Eurasian Union? How do you think that some people say Russia could become a China's satellite? Is this unlikely or not?
Well, Russian-Chinese relations are it's a work in progress, and it's difficult to sort of give you a kind of a yes or no, thumbs up or thumbs down answer. There is a great deal of apprehension in Russian political elites with respect to China, and clearly China poses a kind of challenge for Russian foreign policy that they have yet to fully address, because, you know, objectively speaking, it's a reversal of fortunes on a scale that very few countries have really come to terms with, including ourselves, I should say. What has been happening in the near term is that Russia has, in a sense, and I was in Moscow in December, and I've heard the Russians using the term pivot. So Russia is pivoting to the Pacific as well, and for them, the pivot to the Pacific means primarily a pivot to China. And we've seen a number of developments in Russia, in Russian-Chinese relations, that suggest growing Russian dependence on China. Just I heard, I don't know if it's actually a true fact, but there have been some reports that at Krasnoyarsk Economic Summit just a week or so ago, the Russians have said that they would offer Chinese companies majority stakes in Russian natural resource exploration projects, something that they hadn't done before, would suggest to me that they're finding themselves under greater pressure. The Chinese, at the same time, are not going to do any favors to anybody, so the Russians complain that the Chinese are the toughest negotiators they've ever had to deal with. So, but at the same time, at the political level, they find it convenient to coordinate their foreign policy agendas. Each side has something to gain in certain circumstances in asserting itself at the expense of the United States with the help of the other partner. So it's an important development. We haven't quite gotten our brains around it. It's the one that I think is very much worth watching.
Private businessman. Your thesis that Crimea was a panic move and that further geographical expansion in Ukraine would be probably a bridge too far, and suggests that perhaps with the stalemate that is there currently, perhaps Putin finds himself overextended in Ukraine to some degree, which would suggest too that people's concerns that this was a strategic gambit and that the Baltic states are sort of down the road have to worry about military pressure, intervention, so on. That maybe those concerns are overblown. Can you talk about that? Because it's sort of a big difference between this being strategic and Putin having the confidence to use his military at his will, and the idea that he's found himself now overextended and perhaps would love to be able to find a way out of this.
Right. Well, I think there's plenty to worry about with respect to the Baltic states. Putin may not want to push militarily deeper into Ukraine, although he may, just because it's possible. Because, I mean, as an aside, I should say also, I'm not sure that he fully controls the situation on the ground, and there's sort of layers upon layers of different interests that are acting on the ground. They may not be directly responsive to Moscow's control. This is not a situation where somebody is sitting in Moscow with the proverbial long screwdriver calibrating every move. What I meant to say is that there is a contradiction between Putin's ability, there's a tension between Putin's ability to push militarily and his goal of achieving a political settlement with a pliant, subservient Ukraine. Now, I would also say that he is now embarked on, hesitate to say it, but existential struggle with the West. And what institution represents the West more better or more worse than NATO, which has been portrayed in Russia as the ultimate agent of unwelcome change and threat to Russian security interests. So to the extent that he can weaken NATO, and raise questions about NATO's cohesion, NATO's security guarantees, especially to countries that are vulnerable. I think it's open season in a sense, and he doesn't need to threaten the Baltics with a military incursion, as we know from the experience in Crimea. This can take the form, and this, operations against the Baltics could take place in a variety of forms and domains. Cyber we've already seen. Disinformation campaigns we've already seen. But there are areas of the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, that have large ethnic Russian populations, and Russians, Putin is not averse to using them to create domestic trouble for these countries. So I'd say they're vulnerable, and the challenge here really is, how do we reassure and reinforce them? There's clearly room for more military hard power responses on our part to show that our commitment to their security, Article 5 commitment under the NATO treaty, is there. But there's also the challenge of dealing with these less than full-scale war threats that are, I would say, more real in a sense, more immediate. And also, we don't want a domestic disturbance in one of these countries to escalate into a military crisis. So there is room for us to think about how we deal with these crises in situations short of war. But yes, I'm very worried about them.
So not an optimistic note to end on, but
No.
a challenge. So that's
Certainly
also
a challenge,
So
yeah.
before I ask you to join me in thanking us, we do have some lunch outside for some folks, but we're also having a private lunch with Gene and some folks. So if you're coming to the private lunch, if you just get with Matt down here and he'd show you how to get there, it's in the loose room on the 7th floor. So with that, so come back tomorrow. We have another book event tomorrow. It's called Surviving the End. So if this doesn't work out,
So is this uplifting? Yeah, is that it?
maybe you should check that out.
Yeah.
So please join me in thanking you, Gene.
Thank you.